Hi, my name's Thomas Pera and welcome to the National Retail Association's podcast, Domestic Violence in Retail. With me today, I have Ben Bjarnesen, who has his fingers in all the pies when it comes to all matters domestic and family violence. He's a board member with DVConnect. He's founder of LGBTI DV Awareness Day, which just had its inaugural day on the 28th of May. And he's also a police officer. Welcome, Ben. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, I've done a bit of research into you. You've done quite a few interviews locally around some of the work in some of those many pies we just mentioned. You've discussed how you grew up in the bush and started your career there. But now you're actually living and working in Brisbane. Thought it might be worthwhile sort of unpacking and discussing some of the differences in terms of domestic and family violence in that setting, but also now that you're in the city.
Yeah, so I guess when I worked out west and lived out there, it was more than 8 years ago. So just domestic violence in general in that time has changed dramatically. The awareness of it and the way we respond to it has changed so much. So I couldn't really compare that, but one difference that is still present is just the accessibility to support services and crisis sort of accommodation and that sort of thing in regional areas versus metropolitan.
If I was in, Roma, what services are sort of accessible there?
So I can't talk from what is there now.
Yeah.
But look, when I was there was emergency accommodation, but that emergency accommodation was a small little Red Cross hut, and there was sort of one room for anyone wanting to escape violence. And that was it. Whether that's changed now, could be the case. Like they could have hotel accommodation, that sort of stuff. But obviously in Brisbane we've got 24-hour services. And that's not going to be the case in those sort of rural and remote areas.
Totally. So is there sometimes a case where sometimes people actually have to, if it's crisis accommodation, leave their homes? They might have to leave their actual region that they live in and those sort of connections that they have there and actually go to the city to potentially seek support.
Yeah, look, I guess basing that on Roma and the other small places where I've lived, one of the biggest things about there is everyone knows everyone's business.
Yeah.
So if you are trying to escape a violent situation, it is so much harder for that person to find a safe place to go to.
Yeah.
Because you've just got to speak to one or two people and within a minute you'll know where that person's now staying. And I mean, in those places there's sort of one supermarket, there's one pharmacy, there's one doctor, so there's really limited sort of places where you can go for the sort of services and things like that if you are trying to avoid a particular person or keep yourself safe.
Obviously, as you get into more remote or rural locations, your employees may have more limited options or they may be less inclined to act if they're finding themselves in a violent situation.
That's why it's such a good thing to have organisations like DVConnect, where it's a phone service that's out of those areas where they can talk to someone, where they know that they're not going to be judged, where they know that that person isn't going to be talking about them. Because that is a fear some people have. If I talk to this person, they are neighbours with this person or they're friends with my family or that sort of thing. So that can sort of be a barrier to them accessing support.
Yeah.
Whereas when you can call someone on the phone and know that they're removed from your community and can help you sort of work out a plan for your safety, then that's a really good thing for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ben has spoken a fair bit in the past about having removed himself from an abusive relationship. And so I sort of wanted to talk about, what are some of the unique insights or perspectives from that experience that employers could maybe take on board when they think about how they can support their workers?
Yeah, definitely. So I think some of the main things would firstly be ensuring managers and employees are trained on how to recognise the signs that a colleague might be experiencing or perpetrating domestic violence. And if they do recognise that, then how to respond to it. Also ensuring that all employees understand the impacts of domestic and family violence on individuals in the workplace. Things like making provisions for leave or flexible working arrangements. That was something that wasn't around when I went through it and would have been such a great thing to happen because it was sort of I ended up taking sick leave days or leave days because I couldn't get leave at the time, so I had to take sick leave days to enabled me to get out of that situation. Whereas now, I know for government workers and a lot of other companies as well, you can either access unpaid leave or paid leave, depending on what organisation you work for, to allow you to seek support and remove yourself from that sort of situation.
Yeah, no, there's under the Fair Work Act, you've got the unpaid domestic and family violence leave available. It is worth noting that there are some limits on it. We actually go into some more detail about what sort of leave is available in some of the webinars that we've produced, which is really good. So I definitely recommend anyone listening check those out because they provide a really good grounding around that. But I definitely agree. I think making sure people view the signs as well, because I think sometimes people are very quick to dismiss.
I think we need to get past the old sort of view of that's their business and what goes on in their relationship is for them to work out, and it's not our sort of place to get involved. The sort of view we go by now is it is everyone in the community's responsibility to do something about it. If you're recognising that someone's behaviour changed or you see someone getting jealous or possessive and that sort of stuff, recognising these sort of signs and acting upon those when you can make such a huge difference to people in an abusive relationship and sort of help them to realise what's going on isn't acceptable.
You also pointed out the signs to look for when someone may be actually engaging in domestic and family violence, the jealousy and possessiveness. Because I think that's another thing. People are very in a mindset that they can maybe intervene or have a role to play where someone's experiencing it or is being subject to violence, but maybe they need to just stay out of it if someone's actually engaging in it. I'm sort of curious about your experience. What role you think employers could maybe have in that space?
When I had my experience, my employees didn't know a thing about it.
Yeah.
Friends of mine in the workplace, I have no doubt probably did. But like I said, it was such a long time ago. There was this sort of belief back then that was something for you to deal with in your own time and in your own home and not for them to get involved. Whereas I think I would like to think that had people had a bit more awareness of, what those abusive tactics can look like and what they can actually do, then maybe something could have been done about it earlier. When people don't have the education around what they can actually do, they're obviously more reluctant then to try and do something because it's sort of like, what am I going to do? What can I do? And if they don't know, then nothing happens. Yeah.
And I think also in all fairness, I think there's also a bit of a normalisation of certain behaviours as well. A classic one is emotional manipulation really being overlooked or, dismissed as, they're just emotional, they're just a little bit dramatic.
Yeah, or even blaming those behaviours on something else, like, they were abused as a child, so that's why they behave this way, or they behave this way and then when they use drugs or alcohol, or they behave this way because they've got mental health issues. Things like threats of suicide generally is another method of control that I've seen a lot. But when you look at things like drug and alcohol and that being used as an excuse, it shouldn't be used as an excuse, because if the person knows that they behave in a particular manner or abusive manner when they're drunk or they take drugs, then they're making that choice to become abusive by taking them.
Yeah.
Another one, with my own experience, was the jealousy and stuff being excused as being so in love. I'm just so in love with you. It makes me so furious when, someone else looks at you, or I'm just scared that I'm going to lose you and that's why I get angry. And you go, they must really love me so much. And rather than seeing it for what it is, which is abuse and manipulation.
Sort of following on from some of those personal experiences, obviously, I'm very aware that from knowing you and from how we met that that was a gay relationship, that was with a man. Yep. And that's also really informed a lot of your advocacy in terms of actually highlighting that domestic and family violence has a really distinct and unique impact on LGBTIQ communities. So I thought maybe we could discuss that in a little bit more detail for our listeners.
Yeah, so I guess when we look at LGBTIQ plus people's experience with DV, there's a lot of behaviours and dynamics that are unique to those relationships. There's obviously things like outing of sexuality, gender identity or health status as a method of control, like outing someone to their family, work colleagues or school, that sort of thing. There's isolation from LGBTIQ friends, events or licensed premises, verbal abuse related to gender identity, controlling medications or access to other treatments, or things like ridiculing the other person's expression of sexuality, gender or intersex status. So there's sort of all of the things you would expect to see in any other relationship, but then there's just sort of these added behaviours on top of that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different aspects around it. One of them also we hear a bit is when you look at the rates, there's less interventions, whether that's because people aren't identifying their experience as DV and therefore aren't seeking the support. And so the abuse continues without those interventions. So until we can have our communities recognising what they're experiencing or what they're perpetrating is abuse, then we're going to keep seeing these extraordinary high rates of DV in our communities and really low rates of reporting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of studies that have been done overseas, not so many in Australia. It's starting to grow, but for a while there, I'd say until a couple of years ago, we're relying on stats from the USA. Obviously, there's some similarities with our communities here, but there's still a lot of difference. But more recently, when we look at the Australian stats, last year there was a study done from New South Wales in ACON, which was 62% of gay, bi and trans men and queer men had experienced DV. Only 5.3% of those had reported it to police, and also an extraordinarily low number with support services and things like that. When you look at trans relationships, there's been some stats that have come out that have been in there like 70%
have experienced
DV, and then ones that sort of range from 50. So if we look at whereas previously it was basically the studies that had been done early on was lesbian and bi women, and they were sort of saying around 60% as well. There has been an acknowledgement even through the Domestic Violence Task Force that LGBTI domestic violence is so underreported, under-researched and under-acknowledged, and that there really needs to be some more work done in that area.
Yeah. Separately to obviously having a different experience of domestic and family violence, I think it's also worth maybe unpacking how the existing support structures work for queer people, or whether they don't. You know, I mean, what have you found in that regard?
So the domestic violence sector operates under a very gendered framework, which doesn't necessarily work for LGBTI communities or relationships. When we look at things like refuges, perpetrator behaviour programs, court safe rooms, and things like that, they're all designed to protect women who have had violence perpetrated against them by a man. In Queensland, there are no perpetrator programs or victim survivor groups for LGBTI communities, and that's the case for most of Australia. When we look at refuges, they're generally only available for women. Safe rooms in courthouses only allowed women to enter them, which means female perpetrators can have access to female victims in those safe rooms, and then male victims are forced to sit outside in the general waiting room where the perpetrator can have access to them, rather than being in a safe place where they can be free from intimidation and threats or harm while the matter's being heard in court. This is slowly changing in some states, but there's really an urgent need for that sort of stuff to happen sooner and make those sort of services more accessible to our communities.
And I mean, I suppose I understand why historically the focus has been on, you know, really that traditional model, because that was always, you know, it's about, there's triaging to an extent of like, all right, who needs help most? And I think it's always been historically viewed as like, well, women are the ones most targeted and they're generally targeted by men. But obviously I think we're now getting to a point where we've got a bit more of a developed understanding of how serious the problem is and how important it is to address it. What changes have maybe happened even in just in the last year? Or have there been changes?
So when we look at Queensland, the state government started sort of working on LGBTI Domestic Violence Awareness. They did a campaign in 2019 for a year on LGBTI relationships, domestic violence in those relationships, and gave some funding to Queensland Council for LGBTI Health to do some LGBTI training, whereas that would have been unheard of years ago. So it definitely, things are happening, even just things as simple as the language that we use every day. and making it include everyone and not just one group. Obviously, women and children are the main group of people who are affected by it, but at the same time, we can't forget about all of the thousands of other people who are being affected by it just because they're not in that main group.
It's been brought to the fore that we need to do something. We're moving away from this, we can only help, whoever's in service and focus on the most needy and more focused on, well, everyone's needy. Let's include everyone in our discussions and how we address this.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, the more support services and things like that realise the different needs of all of the different communities, the better position they are in then to respond to it. So it's just a matter of education and awareness. Once we can build that awareness for the different needs of different communities, and I'm not just talking about LGBTI, I'm talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, culturally and linguistically diverse people. Once we know what the sort of individual needs are of those groups, we can respond to it so much better.
Yeah, totally. Good segue into sort of what I want to discuss now, which is more, obviously, we've talked about how domestic and family violence affects the LGBTIQ community, but I think it's also worth maybe us looking at how other vulnerable communities are affected. So obviously, I wanted to get your idea and your read on maybe what some other groups are that are really majorly affected, and we're starting to have similar conversations about well, how can we make the way that we engage and understand and respond to these communities different?
There are so many different vulnerable communities when it comes to domestic and family violence. And like I was saying, each group has its own specific challenges that can affect them. It would really be impossible to sit here and talk about, which group has high needs and that sort of stuff. But I guess a couple of examples would be some faced by our culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Things like victims facing issues when reporting domestic violence as their culture deems it to be a family matter, and that reporting to police or another service would bring shame on their family. And as a result of that could prevent them from reporting the abuse. Another thing could be using a person's visa or residency status as a method of control. So there's sort of all these little different things like that can affect each community.
Yeah, that I think that really makes sense. I mean, I sort of envision, with like that example, I envision, someone comes over, they've got permanent residency, or maybe they're a citizen, and maybe they have a partner come over. That person and their ability to stay in the country is going to be entirely dependent on that partner who's the citizen or the permanent resident.
And I mean, it is worth noting in that circumstance that certain provisions can be made for a person if they are in a DV situation, and that does occur.
So they could potentially see an agent, migration agent, and talk about, all right, what options have I got here? Yeah,
there's some fantastic services around in Brisbane, as well as DVConnect and that sort of thing, that can help people going through that sort of scenario and talk to them about their options and what they need to do.
That's great. All right, well, I'm really glad to hear that exists. Visas is a really, visas and right to work and live in Australia is actually a really tricky area, even with respect to employment law, which is something that NRA often deals with.
Yeah.
It's something that really can be used in an exploitative way. Good to hear that there's actually some consideration about addressing that in the domestic and family violence space as well. What are some of the misconceptions you found that people had about the police's role in relation to domestic and family violence?
When you look at the history of police in LGBTI communities, it hasn't always been a positive one. Some of the reasons why I found that LGBTI people could be hesitant in contacting police or reporting even to support services, things like those historical negative incidents involving police in LGBTI communities, things like the Stonewall riots when we look at Australia, Sydney Mardi Gras in the 70s. Specifically for Queensland, homosexuality was illegal until 1991.
Yeah.
So it's quite recent history, which people still think that we like that. Unfortunately, or that the police services are like that around Australia. And obviously, with the legislation from times like that, there was a history of police targeting LGBTI people. there can be a perception of interpersonal or institutionalised homophobia and transphobia, and also fear that they'll be ridiculed or harassed by police because of their sexuality or gender identity. And as well as that, there's the fear that they might be outed if they do go to police and report. So there's all of these sort of things like that can prevent people from wanting to report to police. Thankfully, so much has changed over the years with police services around the country. Obviously, I can speak for Queensland. The amount of change that's happened in even just the last 5 years is incredible. There's still work to do. We'll always need to be doing more work. Obviously, any organisation or department can always do better and evolve. But, yeah, there's been an incredible amount of work done, and thankfully can say that those times are well behind us now.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose I wanted to ask, what would you recommend, how can the average bystander or, in our situation, employers, how can they reach out to police? Is there a place for them to reach out to police from what you've seen?
I guess the main part of it is if it's something that's happening at the time, and
if there's safety at risk, if there's health and safety at risk.
Yeah, if there's a risk to the person at the time, then definitely call police, and otherwise you can call an organisation like DVConnect who can give you advice on all the different options that are available.
Yeah, if there's health and safety at risk, 100% call the police. That's something that holds employers back a lot of the time is they might see something going on, but they're like, oh, what do I do? There's that hesitance to take action because they don't even know where to begin.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about DVConnect or 1-800-RESPECT is you don't have to be the person experiencing the violence or abuse. You can be the employer, the colleague, the friend, the family member, and ring in to say, hey, this is what's going on with my friend. Can you give me some advice on what the things are that I can do to help them be safe?
Yeah, 100%. And actually, for any of our retailers listening, we've also just recently produced a bit of a guide that can also act as a bit of a prompt as to how you might want to approach it. So I also wanted to move into, now obviously I highlighted this at the start, you are a board member with DVConnect. For those who don't know, can you explain some of the work that DVConnect does?
Yeah, so DVConnect helps Queenslanders who are experiencing domestic and family violence find pathways from violence to safety. They can provide emergency transport and accommodation for anyone wanting to escape violence or an abusive home. And they also provide crisis counselling, safety planning, information and referral options so that people are informed of what to do and how to stay safe and whether they're staying in or leaving an abusive relationship. DVConnect operates 3 helplines that Queenslanders can call. They've got the Women's Line, helping anyone who identifies as female, who's looking for practical support options or safety planning due to their or their children's experience of domestic and family violence. The Men's Line, who helps Queenslanders who identify as male or who are either using violence or experiencing violence in a domestic or family relationship. And then the Sexual Assault Helpline for anyone who's experienced sexual assault or sexual violence recently or historically.
That's really, really great, really comprehensive. I mean, in your experience, which is quite a bit, how important a role can employers play when a person is experiencing domestic and family violence?
So employers are vital. Often the workplace is only one of the only locations where someone experiencing abuse feels safe or where they have some form of escape and independence from a person using violence. I guess how the workplace makes itself available to staff to feel comfortable in making disclosures and how it reacts or responds to these disclosures can be really pivotal in either encouraging further help or, when done poorly, can deter people from disclosing again, or seeking further support.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something we have also really tried to highlight in a lot of our webinars and our guide. It's really, I think, really highlighting that whole idea of this is a community problem and the workplace is a really important part of that community. It's one of the few places where if someone's, working full-time or something, in their day, that might be one of the only chances they get to be away from an abusive partner or a family member or whoever may be engaging in violence against them.
Yeah.
it's a place where they can potentially get respite and even have, those interpersonal relationships that are completely separated from the partner, I think, as well, Sometimes that's the other thing, often when someone's got a partner or a family member, there's a high chance that there's a lot of intersection and overlap with their friends.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important that people in the workplace have some awareness of what a healthy and what an abusive relationship looks like, and picking up on those signs that a person might be experiencing or using domestic violence, and having the confidence to stand up and do something about it.
Yeah.
Help that person out.
Creating a new norm that it's okay to maybe be a little bit more frank.
Yeah. It's, I think I said it earlier, but we've sort of gone from that belief that, DV is something to be dealt with at home or dealt with by a certain organisation, like, the police to pick it up or someone else to recognise and respond to it. It has to be a joint effort. It has to be police, support organisations, community organisations, friends, family, sporting clubs, workplaces.
Yeah.
Everybody has to work together if we're going to be able to nip this in the bud.
Yeah, absolutely. With all this experience, what would you say are some of the most important lessons you want all the business owners and retailers listening right now to take away from, the discussion today?
The first thing I would say is together we as a community can end domestic and family violence. We can do it by challenging damaging gender and sexuality stereotypes, by empowering your employees, educating our young people on what a healthy relationship looks like, and, like I said, acknowledging and responding to the needs of our diverse and vulnerable communities, and championing change through small steps and education and awareness within your businesses. Domestic and family violence is preventable, but we need everybody to be on board to make the world safe for all.
Beautiful. I think that's a good note to end on. So if retailers are listening right now and they're dealing with domestic and family violence, can they call DVConnect for further guidance?
Yeah, definitely. They can call up and DVConnect will give free advice, and also you can learn more about domestic violence workplace training. They can also make simple steps and proactive steps like making pamphlets or posters available about domestic and family violence services, phone numbers that are available, and calling police if they witness a serious incident. But like I said, they can always call DVConnect for guidance around how to help someone in a crisis if they're unsure, because it's a 24/7 service.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Ben. It was really good talking to you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for all of our retailers and members who may be listening. Thank you so much for joining us and listening to the NRA's Domestic Violence in Retail podcast.
Thanks for listening. The Domestic Violence Retailer Support Hub is a project of the National Retail Association in conjunction with the Queensland Government. Catch up and contribute at www.dvretail.com.au.